Welcome, everyone. Thank you for taking the time out of your day to join us. We are Nick and Bob Slater, the authors of Look Out Above, The Young Professional's Guide to Success. We are all about helping you make the most of what we call the first five. Now, that is the first 5 or so years out of grad school or law school that you're in the professional workplace. So our objective is to help you be different and to be better. That is to stand out while fitting in. So as we sometimes do, I'm going to start off today with a couple of administrative notes. So a recording of today's session and every one of these sessions will be available soon on our website. That's bobandnickslater.com. And while you're on the website, you can find other good content there, like a free chapter of our book. There's an assessment and some other kind of fun stuff. And also, big news, our YouTube channel is officially launched and we will be adding to it continually. It's got a couple videos up there now. And the goal is to have everything we do video-wise on there in the near future. So check that out and subscribe if you'd like. Now on to today's business. So last time we talked about something that, or a topic that for a lot of folks is pretty stressful. We talked about giving presentations and public speaking. And specifically, we talked about the optimal presentation structure. So we're not talking presentations today, but we are talking about something that gives people anxiety all the same. And that is the topic of negotiation. So while negotiation didn't get its own chapter in our book, we do consider it without a doubt to be a critical skill to have in your arsenal in both your professional and personal lives, really. So Dad, why don't you start us off today by maybe touching on why we feel negotiation is so important and why it's worthy of our beloved listeners' time and effort to
Sure, Nick.
develop this soft skill. Thanks.
So I will just say we did write the chapter, and
Mhm.
the only reason it didn't get in the book, we do consider it an essential skill, was because of space concerns. We didn't want to make the book too long. And we know that not everybody negotiates professionally as part of their job, but we suspect many of you do or will. So it is important. And whether you know it or not, or like it or not, you and all of us were professional negotiators if you consider negotiating for money to make you a professional negotiator. We negotiate for money and often for love and things much more important than money every single day. So we negotiate for big ticket items like houses and cars and appliances. We negotiate the terms of our employment. We try to negotiate raises if we can. Many of us negotiate when what we do in business every day. And even those of you that don't, you probably will someday. And these negotiations affect our wallet, they affect our happiness, our quality of life. And so this success is really important to you. It's important that you be able to negotiate. And it would seem that if you become a better negotiator, you'll get more out of life. So it's worthy of your time and effort, as Nick said, of our beloved listeners, which is true. So given that it's so important, you would think people study it. They would read the texts of the great masters and they would go to negotiation seminars like Chester Karris's, which is a terrific one. But alas, most people don't. They don't really want to know how to negotiate because of the conflict involved. It's kind of uncomfortable. And so that scares a lot of people off. And they've never been told how to do it. They don't understand the principles. They didn't learn it at school. Their parents didn't teach them. They just sort of fall into having to do it. So often people just hurry up and get it over with as fast as they can, and that is not a winning strategy. So it's not imperative that you ever love negotiating, but you do want to be competent at it. And it'll reduce your stress level. It'll get you better outcomes. If you have a structured approach, if you prepare, and if you know and apply certain principles. And so Nick and I sort of consider our work here negotiation for people who don't really like to negotiate. But if you follow what we're going to tell you and you prepare for your negotiations, you'll have done everything you can do and have peace about it. What more can you do? And you'll get better outcomes.
Right. Thanks, Dad. Yeah, I'll just add in law school, I think one of the most valuable experiences I had, and it wasn't a full class, but more of a seminar. So 2 or 3 days or so was just a negotiation seminar where they brought in some people from the business world and kind of taught us how to negotiate on behalf of our clients was the theory. And it was really valuable. And I know you do something similar in your real estate course too. So with that, so today's session is going to begin a 3-part series about negotiation. So we're going to spend our next 3 Zoominars, so the next month plus or so of Zoominar content as follows. So today we're going to be talking about the negotiation planning process. And then in a couple of weeks, we're going to talk about tips and tactics for handling the actual bargaining process, the actual negotiation once it starts. And then for third, we're going to wrap up in our final session with contracting. So that is how to effectively what we call, or what is called, paper your deals so that you achieve the outcomes you agree to in your negotiations. Because if you can't effectively paper your deal, then all the hard negotiating and all the concessions you've won during your negotiation are for naught. So now, if this doesn't sound like something that could benefit you right now, maybe because you haven't been tasked with negotiating yet or don't see it, happening for you in the near future at your job, we urge you to listen anyway, because the higher up you go, the more you're going to be tasked with negotiating. That's almost a guarantee. And the higher you go, the higher the stakes of those negotiations will be. So this is really valuable stuff, even if you're not going to get a chance to employ it in your professional life, at least right now. So, Dad, let's start with this question: where to begin with learning to be a better negotiator?
Okay, Nick, we're going to give a 5-step planning process here. And the first step is to know yourself. And that is, are you a competitive style or cooperative style negotiator? Most of us lean heavily to one style or the other, and it's just who you are, and it's going to be fine, and you're not going to change it, and you don't want to change it, but you need to know what style you are. And you're going to use tactics that are both competitive and cooperative, but essentially at your core, you are either a cooperative or competitive negotiator. So I'll talk about the competitive style, and I'll hand it back to Nick on the cooperative style. Competitive style negotiators are on a mission to claim as much value as they can. They don't lose sleep over notions of fairness or equity. They negotiate aggressively for themselves, their families, their clients, whoever, as the case may be. And in the trade, people who write and study negotiation call competitor negotiators Soviet style, because that was often the style of Soviets when negotiating to buy grain or sell the rights to the Olympics for TV, etc. Just very aggressive, extreme demands, etc. And so that's a competitive negotiator, but there's nothing wrong or immoral about it. It just means that the competitive negotiators are not as interested in a win-win for all sides. They're interested in a win for themselves. And this has its pros and cons. The advantage of a competitive style negotiator, negotiating and style, is you negotiate better deals. They get better deals. There are cons, however, disadvantages. One, you'll close fewer deals. You'll gridlock more because the other side will not accept extreme demands, and that's just what happens. Another disadvantage is people who feel steamrolled by you won't ever want to do business with you. And then the third concern you would have, if this is your style, is that if some kind of further performance is required by the party you negotiated with, they may just say, screw it, I'm not doing it, because they felt like they got steamrolled in the process. So that's the competitive style, the Soviet style, which is the aggressive, go for everything I can style. Nick, why don't you give us the yin to that yang?
Sure. Let's do the kind of the flip, the opposite side of the coin to the competitive style negotiator, which is cooperative style. So a cooperative negotiator prefers that every negotiation would be what we call a win-win for both sides. So both sides would come away happy in the ideal world for a cooperative negotiator. So in that style, you start with the premise that maybe each side's objectives are not so different or not so contrasting, I suppose, and that each side can come away happy and that get what he or she wants. And that the way to do that is by working together to reach more satisfying solutions for both sides. So it's not what a competitive negotiator would have as a mindset going in. The cooperative style negotiators tend to be more relationship focused than their counterparts. And again, just like with any style, there are pros and cons of using the cooperative style, or that being kind of your default. So the pro makes it's pretty easy to see. The pro is that you're going to likely reach more deals, and you're going to reach them more readily than your competitive negotiators who perhaps fight for every last dime on the table or every last concession. The cooperative negotiators are going to be more likely to concede a point. And so sometimes you'll find a better deal for both sides. So sometimes it truly will be a win-win with the cooperative style. That does happen. This might be a new term for you, but what we call elegant deals, so those are creative deals that kind of identify and satisfy each side's underlying needs. Those are elegant deals, and those are really only achievable through cooperative negotiating. So elegant deals is kind of a professional term of art. Now, of course, there are cons. The cons again, it's kind of clear is that you may not get nearly as good a deal as you could have had you been a little more competitive, a little more demanding in your negotiations. You might be leaving something on the table that perhaps a competitive negotiator wouldn't have. He or she would have done everything he or she could to get that extra concession. So the the extreme worst case of a competitive negotiator to us would be somebody who just simply doesn't like to negotiate for whatever reason, is scared of it, perhaps scared of conflict, avoidant. And so he or she is in charge of negotiations and just wants to get it over with as quickly as possible. So if that's the case, then that negotiator is likely leaving a lot on the table and coming away with the deal, but a pretty sorry one. So does the cooperative style work in negotiation? I mean, absolutely. It definitely can, and it does. Um, it's particularly effective when the negotiating parties have a relationship that's critical, or that's, well, both critical and also needs to be continuing in the future. So this includes situations, for example, where you're likely to negotiate with that party again. You're going to see them again. You might need something from them again. The point is you're going to have a continuing relationship. And so you have to respect that when negotiating. You can't blow it up as a competitive negotiator might be prone to, just in an effort to win the deal. So we talk sports here a lot. In professional sports, some player agents have developed such a reputation for overly competitive, you could say ruthless or even shady negotiating, that some teams will just refuse to deal with them anymore. So what that means is these teams would rather pass on a potential, star player than negotiate with his agent, which is kind of crazy. And you don't want or need that type of cutthroat reputation at all. So just recognize that familiarity and the likelihood of engaging in future business interjects, or at least should interject, some element of cooperative negotiating into your style. So kind of a recap on preferred styles. Yeah, your preferred style kind of is what it is, and it really depends on your personality, and it's unlikely to change. And you don't need to change your style, or certainly you don't need to change who you are in order to be an effective negotiator, since both styles and hybrids of styles can work. You're going to have your own style, and you're going to kind of learn it and develop it over time, and it should be just fine. But you do need to know about these competitive versus cooperative styles of negotiation, really so that you can be on guard to address the risks uh, of each style and the shortcomings that each style has, because they both do have their cons, as we mentioned previously. So to be a competent, successful negotiator, you're going to need to use both cooperative and competitive tactics over time. And again, over time, you're kind of going to get a feel for which style is right for which moment. And it's going to depend on context, of course, but also in who you're dealing with the other side of the table. So only by knowing that you're naturally competitive, say you're a naturally competitive person or negotiator, will you be able to kind of push yourself to engage in only by knowing you're naturally cooperative, I should say, will you push yourself to engage in competitive tactics when the time calls for it. And then on the flip side of the coin, only by realizing and acknowledging that you're more of a competitive person, a competitive negotiator, will you be able to remind yourself to kind of caution yourself sometimes to engage in cooperative tactics when you need to, and maybe tone it down a little bit. So that's cooperative versus competitive negotiating styles and tactics. But now we're going to talk about the process itself. So let's talk about the 5-step negotiation planning process, Dad. And I'll kick it to you to start with step.
All right. Well, the first one you've just covered, which is
Yep.
know your style. And really, as Nick just said, you need to know your style because you've got to push yourself to get out of your comfort zone or tone it down, depending on what it is. But you start by knowing your style. The second thing in the planning process is now you're going to identify the key issues in the negotiation, and then you're going to either characterize your negotiation as a fixed pie or an expandable pie. And I wish I had a more catchy phrase than an expandable pie, but either it's a piece of pie you're cutting up and it's fixed, or there's a way to make the pie bigger. And so you start by looking at what are the primary issues of this negotiation. That's going to be your clue as to what type of negotiation you're into. So if you were buying a house, you would say, well, it's going to be the sales price, how much money I have to put down, whether there are any contingencies, how are we going to handle the repair inspection process, which blows a lot of deals out? Are there going to be contingencies, that kind of stuff? If you were negotiating a construction contract, you'd say, well, it's going to be the price. It's going to be the scope of work. What am I getting and what am I not getting for that price? When is it going to be done by? What's the warranty? Those kinds of issues. And so you look at these issues and you say, well, is there room for a lot of give and take and expanding the pie, or is it really dividing the pie up? And so a fixed pie is one, obviously, where it's limited. So you're negotiating with an insurance company. It's just how much money are you going to get? Or you're buying a car. It's just going to be, you want to pay the least amount you can. The car dealer wants you to pay the most you can. So we engage in a lot of these fixed pie negotiations every day. It's particularly over money. It's just who's going to get more and who's going to get less. So that's the fixed pie. Nick, what's an expandable pie?
Sure. So if that's fixed pie, then in contrast, an expandable pie negotiation is about expanding the pie. And how you do that is you create value so that both sides can get what they need. So an expandable pie negotiation is one where you and your counterpart or counterparts on the other side try to kind of go below the surface and dig real deep to determine and satisfy each other's underlying interests. It's more of a cooperative process. So you're negotiating for shared gain rather than to dominate the other side. So here's just a few examples of expandable pie negotiations. So you've got negotiations between customers and merchants, except of course at car dealerships, especially used car dealerships. You've got negotiations between clients and service providers, vendors and manufacturers, employers and employees, and at least ideally between spouses. So cooperative style negotiators tend to look at most negotiations as expandable pie negotiations, or at least as negotiations to equitably share a fixed pie. So it's pretty rare that you're going to have it just a straight up expandable pie negotiation or a straight fixed pie negotiation. More likely, you're going to have elements of both fixed and expandable pies in your negotiation. So some items maybe can be expanded to meet the needs of both parties, while other items are firm. They require bargaining over a limited quantity of something valuable. You can't expand. It is what it is. And sometimes you can transform what seems like a fixed pie negotiation into something greater. So while one is not, a negotiation is not likely to be one or the other, they're usually at their essence more one type than the other. So as part of your planning, in pre-negotiation planning, identify the type of negotiation you're about to engage in, the type you're about to get into, and look at the pie and kind of figure it out.
And as we're going to talk about next time, that's going to guide your tactics.
Right.
So step 3, you've figured out your cooperative or competitive. You've kind of figured out the essential character of the negotiation. Is it going to be fixed or expandable pie? You've identified the issues which help you do that. Now you're going to do step 3, which is you're going to analyze what's called your TIP, time, information, and power. Stated differently, you're going to try to figure out how strong is your case now, and then what can you do about it? So why do you do this? Well, you need a realistic assessment of the strength of your negotiating position, and you want to improve it to the extent you can. It's critical to do it for 2 reasons. Number one, the more power you have and use it, the better your outcomes are going to be. So if you have leverage and you use it, then you're going to do better. But the second, less obvious reason to really understand your tip is psychological. The perception of power is power. So if you act like you have power, whether you really do or not, that sends a message that you have power. And so it's really important that you believe you have a strong negotiating position. Like if you have money and you're trying to buy something, you can walk and not buy it. So it's important that you believe you have strength, because you're going to give that vibe off, and you want to give off a positive vibe. Now, some people are really good at giving off the impression of strength even when they know they don't have it. And they play poker on ESPN2 all the time. But for most of us, if you're more like me, I'm not a great bluffer. I'd rather really believe in my case and work to build it up. And that's where I'm going to get my power, and that's the vibe I'm going to give off. So let's take a look at time, information, and power. Nick's going to take the first one, which is time.
Sure. So time. So time is power for somebody in negotiation. So if you didn't realize that before, now you do. You've got to figure out who and for who and why. Why is time powerful for somebody in your negotiation? So more often than not, if you're under a deadline crunch or coming right up against it, especially if your deadline is known by the other side, then you're going to be at a real disadvantage in bargaining. So side note to that, if you are under a deadline crush, don't alert the other side to that right away. So the one in the negotiation who feels more constrained by time is likely to make more substantial concessions, especially as the deadline comes up, because he or she has got to get the deal done in his mind. So conversely, if you're not under the crush of a deadline, if you've got all the time in the world, that this gives you the luxury of being patient, taking your time, and really waiting on the right deal terms to come to you. You're not under a time crunch to make sure you get a deal done. So about the deadline, who imposes it? Well, of course, it's going to depend. So often it's going to be imposed on you by your own needs or by the needs of your company or your organization, whoever you're negotiating for. Um, so say this is a bit of an example for personal life, but say you need a house before school starts, or because your spouse is tired of looking at houses. So then that's a real time crunch you're under. You need a car because yours is broken down and you don't have a way to get to work. You need to close a deal because your boss has put a deadline on you. So then you're under a deadline. So alternatively, a deadline may be imposed by the other side, and they might do so to kind of to inspire action. They want to get you moving on this negotiation. So a seller might say you have until Friday to submit your what he or she says best and final offer, best and final bid. So even though you're not under any internal pressure from your boss or from your organization or from yourself to do that deal by Friday, I mean, to you, Friday is a totally arbitrary deadline, and you're under no pressure to do this deal at all, really. If you want to make a play for this seller's property, you now have a deadline imposed by the seller, or at least an apparent deadline. So keeping the same theme here about deadlines, you could turn the tables and impose a deadline in an effort to put time pressure on the other side, just what the other side has done to you in the previous example. So if you do that, though, you have to be wary of what you're going to do if the other side kind of calls your bluff, and test the reality of any deadlines you've imposed. They may choose to ignore it. They may choose to negotiate around it. But remember, if you keep drawing new lines in the sand with deadlines or with anything really, you risk developing the reputation as a bluffer. And at the least, the other side in your current negotiation will be skeptical of what you say for the rest of your negotiation. So be careful with that and know what you're going to do in the event that the other side calls your bluff. So, of course, time is usually more helpful to one side than the other in a negotiation. So before you get down into the nitty gritty of actually negotiation, give it some thought and figure out, if you can, how to make time work for you, or at least for how to make time not seriously work against you. Recognize that you may have to negotiate internally with your supervisor, with your boss, really with your own side, to get out from under the constraints of a counterproductive deadline.
So, Nick, you may remember the Onion article about Nacho Slim, who kept moving the line that would trigger him actually engaging in a gunfight. He was very conciliatory.
I sure do remember it. In fact, that's what inspired me to talk about making a new line in the sand. So one of my favorites.
That's a great.
Pretty tough bargain of that guy.
You can Google the Onion and Nacho Slim. It's a very funny article, a lot of negotiation wisdom. So academic studies do show that it often takes a deadline to move parties to actually start making concessions and move. So time is the first and tip, information is the second. So what do you want information about? Really two things. You want information first about the subject matter of the negotiation. So whether it's about the cost of a house or the rent per square foot or the scope of work to a contract, you may need to do some research so that you understand what it is you're negotiating about better. So Nick and I are both former attorneys, and when you try cases and you try to negotiate settlements around those cases, you have to learn the subject matter. So I was in a defective tire case. I was in another case where the allegation was that the electrical wire, the PVC lining on the electrical wire caused a major fire. So you may have to, you can't negotiate a settlement without really understanding the science, and especially if you have to explain it to somebody. So the first thing you may need to do is better understand the subject matter. Now, if you're negotiating something that's part of your job and you do it all the time, then that's probably not a problem for you. You already have mastered the subject matter of the negotiation. So the second thing you're going to want information about is the other side. And we'll talk a minute about how you might go about getting that. But some of it is just stopping and thinking about it. What do you think they want out of the negotiation? What are their concerns? What would they need to get to save face? What are their expectations? What are their time constraints, to pick back up on what Nick was talking about? If they don't do a deal with you, what are their alternatives to doing a deal? Do they have pretty good ones, or ones that are just as good? who will make the decisions for them? Who will be negotiating for them? And what's their style? Do you think they're going to be competitive? Do you think they're going to be cooperative? So how much of this information do you already know about the subject matter and the other side? You need to consider that and figure out where your holes are and how you can go start closing those information holes. So that brings us to power. And there's lots of power that comes out of time, either not being under a deadline, having all the time in the world, and information, having lots of information, particularly if the other side doesn't, like an insurance negotiation. Nick, why don't you talk about other sources of power?
Sure, will do. So as you just said, that in addition to time and information, which are great sources of power, there are many more, and I'll list a few of them here. But it's not an exhaustive list. There are definitely more than this. So, what other sources of power do we have? Well, alternatives. If you have alternatives, that's a source of power. So, the more options the other side thinks you have, the greater your power. And similarly, the more options you think you have, the greater your power in negotiating. So, it's not even necessarily a reflection of reality, it's more perception. Now, a corollary to alternatives equal power is that leverage equals power. So I like to think in terms of leverage when I'm thinking about negotiating. So in a negotiation, who has the leverage? So alternatives give me leverage. So determine your options. Hopefully you have some other ones, and work hard to create more options, because you do need to have other options. And then determine what is called your best alternative to a negotiated agreement. That's your BATNA, sorry. So if you walk away from the negotiating table and you gridlock hopelessly, you're just not going to reach a deal with this opposing party. What can you do to meet your needs elsewhere? Because your needs obviously haven't gone away. You just can't reach them in this negotiation. So what will it cost to go elsewhere? What is the timing looking like? How likely is it that you're going to be able to successfully pull off the BATNA? Of course, you don't want to think about this when the negotiation stalls. You want to have thought about this well in advance so that you can use that as a source of power. So if you have thought through that in advance, it's going to help it's going to help guide you in your negotiation, as it's going to provide kind of a test, a baseline by which to compare how any given proposal from the other side stacks up against your alternative. So you're able to kind of negotiate concession, so a potential deal from your adversary now, but it maybe doesn't stack up to the deal you are reasonably confident you could get elsewhere. So if that's the case, then you don't take the deal. So also give thought to your counterpart's BATNA. It's just as important. So what are their alternatives if they can't do a deal with you? Do they need to do a deal with you? And if they do, that voila, there you have some leverage there. So that's alternatives equal power. Also, investment equals power. So the more resources expended and aggravation endured in pursuit of a goal, the greater desirability. It's kind of psychology 101. So the more time and effort you can get your counterpart on the other side to expend trying to get a deal done with you, the more likely they will be to get a deal done with you, and probably on terms that are favorable to you and your side. Now, that we're not advocating to be a jerk and to be ruthless and to just be incredibly difficult at every turn, but do recognize that the more effort I don't want to say opponent, but your adversary expends on on negotiating with you, the more likely it is that he's just going to say at the end, let's just do this deal. So that's investment means power equals power. And another source of power is money. So there are exceptions here, but generally it's easy to buy things when you have cash. And conversely, it's harder to sell things because there's a limited supply of people with cash and a seemingly unlimited supply of other people selling things. So cash truly is king. So while there may be times when not having money or enough money to pay more actually is advantageous for your position, those times are pretty rare. More often than not, it's a pretty safe assumption that if you have money to spend, that's a source of power. And one more source of power is principles. So a reputation for deadlocking for the sake of core values and kind of bedrock principles may be a source of power for you. So consider this: how are you viewed by the other party you're negotiating against? Do you have a reputation at all? And so at this point, you're likely in the first few years of your career, so your negotiating experience, at least at work, might be limited. So maybe you don't have a reputation built yet, but I can rest assured that you will. And in fact, you're likely developing it right now. So consider your reputation and how the other side views you as a negotiator. So if you've never gridlocked and you always walk away with a deal, don't be so quick to use that as a bragging point. Maybe that means you've been a little too cooperative and you're leaving stuff on the table. Maybe you're settling for less than you could. So just be aware of it. And last source of power that I'll mention is indifference. So a guy we like who's great negotiator, has written great books on it. His name's Herb Cohen. He says, in terms of negotiating, care, of course, care, but not that much, as opposed to really caring, negotiating as if your life depended on it. So by seeming to want something only, but only so much, or to have other options that suit you just as well, you can exert a lot of leverage over someone who really wants something from you, who needs something from you. It's kind of the DGAF attitude. You'll know what that means. It can be a really valuable thing in life for sure, but also specifically in negotiating. So I said Herb Cohen, by the way, his book, How to Go to Negotiate Anything, is really, it's just phenomenal. We highly recommend it for a little further reading on the subject. I think it has a sequel as well. So as I said a minute ago, the list is not exhaustive. There are more sources of power than that, but those are some big ones. So think about it. Are there more that you can come up with on your own? I bet there are, but that's a good list to start with.
So alternatives, investment, money,
Mhm.
principles, indifference, those are all sources of power. So now you've analyzed your tip and you've got a sense of how strong your position is and hopefully sort of how you're going to play that in the negotiation. But on the other hand, you probably found some holes in it. So you're going to want to go try to close those holes because obviously the studies show that the most successful negotiators are the ones who develop their power and then they use it during the negotiation. So write down where you think you're weak and then get to work. Where do you find the information? Obviously, the internet's a rich source of information. You can go to the library, you can go to the courthouse if you need to. You can call people who've negotiated with the people you're about to. Call competitors on the other side. You can obtain offers from sellers or buyers if you're in a real estate deal to try to create competition. So, Nick, what's the next step?
Yep. So now I think we're on to step four. You think I can keep track of the steps. I think I screwed it up earlier. But anyways, the current step that we're on now is to set your goal and to make it a high goal. So obviously you've done your research, you've done your background study on your adversary on the other side, et cetera. And based on your research now you set your goal and make it a high one, make it a lofty goal. So studies show that people with higher aspiration levels will just win higher awards. So it makes sense, right? I mean, you've been taught that and told that, I'm sure, your whole life. So just like in other areas of life, those who set goals and set high goals at that, they just achieve more. It's just how it is. So of course, what a high goal is depends on the context of your negotiation. It'll be different for every negotiation. So up your aspiration level and be specific. Make your goals precise and make them measurable, like down to a dollar level, if that's applicable. A good goal is not, just to get a good result or to get the most that I can or even to win. So that too nebulous, too vague, those ain't going to cut it. And they need to be specific and dollarize them if you can. And in complicated negotiations, also, you may need to set multiple goals. So consider three different buckets or categories of goals. And now I'm going to list them in descending order of importance. So most to least important. So you're going to start with your must have. So your must have goals, this is your reason or your reasons for doing the deal. Absolutely critical when you walk away from the deal. If the deal is done, then you need to have achieved these or this. So next is your would like to haves. So these are important, but there's a little more room to maneuver here. And you can trade some of the would like to haves, but only if it's going to help you achieve one of your must haves, your primary objectives. Then finally, we have the tradables. So the tradable items still have value, but they may be more important to the other side than to you. So use that as a leverage play. So these items can be kind of grudgingly swapped for a concession by the other side that has for something that has greater value to you. So really, the real value in tradables, I think, is that you can trade them for something that's of more value. So again, with another dumb sports analogy, think of maybe a second round pick in the NBA draft as a tradable. So at the same time as you set your goal, consider why the other side should do your deal. Remember, this is kind of a theme for negotiation planning. Everything that you do, consider what your opponent would do, or consider your opponent's thinking. So, why should the other side do the deal? So, as one successful real estate developer in Raleigh, where I formerly lived, said, let them make some money, them being, of course, the other side in the deal or in the negotiation. Otherwise, why would they continue to do business with you? So if you completely destroy the other side in a negotiation, why would they do business or continue a relationship with you in the future? So Dad, that's step four, I believe. Why don't you talk about the fifth and final step?
Sure, Nick, that's fine. And the point I was trying to make a minute ago is if you're a seller, obviously you want to create competition. Like if you're selling a house, you want as many buyers as you can get.
Sure.
But if you're buying something, you want to eliminate competition. You'd like to go to the seller and who's not selling their house and try to buy it. And you don't want a feeding frenzy of people competing with you.
Sure.
So
Sure.
let's go to step 5. So Nick said you're now going to set your goals. You're going to figure out your must-haves, like-to-haves, your tradables. So your last step in this process is you got to decide whether or not you want to open or let the other side open. And then you need to figure out what your opening offer is going to be. So I think the most stressful part of a negotiation is just the beginning. Once you kind of get into it, it becomes fun, if that's the right word, but it's not nearly as stressful. But what is stressful is kind of getting it started. You know, are we going to have a lot of chit chat or are we going to get right into it?
Mhm.
But the way to reduce that stress is figure out, do you want to open or not? And then where you're going to open and why. And so let's talk about the pros and cons of each real quick. So the advantage of opening first is that you set expectations. It's like the sticker price on a car. You know, that's really an opening offer by the seller of the car at the new car lot or the used car lot. And if you let the other side open first, then they're setting the expectations and they're trying to manage your expectations. Like it's going to be way up here or it's going to be way down there. There's an advantage though, if not opening first, is that you learn what the other side values. You know, how do they price this thing? And you gain insight into whether they're extreme and competitive or more cooperative. And so generally the rule is you want to open first unless you have more subject matter knowledge. So insurance companies, the dreaded insurance companies, no disrespect for any of you who work for them,
Yes.
but they're smart. They let the client, the customer open because they know exactly what the claim's worth, whether it's a loss of a body part or a damaged fender, and they're hoping the person will offer less than they were willing to pay. But generally, unless you have more subject matter knowledge, you're going to want to be the one to open. So now, how do you figure out what to say and how to make, where to figure out where in the range of outcomes do you want to open? So generally, an unreasonable opening offer is one that you think is way outside the other side's expectations of what's reasonable. And a reasonable opening offer is one that you think might be within their range of expectations where they might want to interrupt and end up. And so if it's cooperative or competitive, that will matter to you. Is it a relationship that's continuing? That will matter to you, or could you care less? You're never going to see the person again and you just want to buy the car at the cheapest price. So generally, you're going to let the type of negotiation decide how extreme your offer will be. But you got to give yourself room to come down or go up. You're never going to get a, oh yes, that's fine, or I haven't anyway. So you got to have room to move and get where you want to get the goal that Nick talked about. And generally, you're going to want to have some anchor, some reasonable standard, something you can point to as the basis for your offer. It's not going to be you just picked it out of the air. But here's why I think this is reasonable. This is why I think this is a fair. Now, you can tone it down. If it's an aggressive offer, you could say, well, this is written in chalk, or I was thinking this. You probably should use nice language if you use a really extreme offer. So that's my thought, or those are our thoughts on how to
Right.
open and who should open and sort of how to go about it.
Great. Thanks, Dad. So that's it. That's our 5-step approach for planning a successful negotiation. That's kind of a lot. That's kind of a meaty 5 steps. So I'm going to recap them really briefly here. So step 1, identify whether you're a naturally competitive negotiator or a cooperative negotiator. Of course, you won't have to identify this before every negotiation, but as a new young professional negotiator, you're going to want to do that now. Step 2 is break down the issues of each of your negotiation and identify the type of negotiation it's going to be, expandable versus fixed pie, etc. Step 3 is assess your tip. That's time, information, and power. Step 4 is to set your goal and to set it high. And step 5, finally, is to decide if you have or if you are allowed to make the decision whether to make or to receive the first offer, and if so, what that first offer will be. So, of course, the importance of the negotiation to you and to your company will drive how much you prepare for it. But I'll say this, if the first time you think about what to say and what to offer and kind of your strategy is when you're driving to the meeting, or even worse, when you're sitting down or sitting on the plane or even about to pick up the phone, whatever, that's a big problem. It's especially a big problem at this point in your career where you're, as I just said a minute ago, likely young and kind of new to negotiating. You're likely not super experienced in complex negotiations. You need to put the work in before you sit down and negotiate. If you're going to be successful at this, you're really going to need to learn the other side and figure out who you are as a negotiator, and really do the things we mentioned in these 5 steps well before you get down to actually negotiating, which we'll cover in a couple of weeks. Like most things involving hard work, whether professional or not, once you start and you kind of get to work and you get excited about the progress you're making, and you will make progress, your stress level will go down and your enthusiasm will go up. You might even find that you have a taste for negotiating. Some people really enjoy it. I like it, for example. I kind of look forward to it. So like any of the soft skills we talk about, and that's really what we cover most in our book and Look Out Above, is soft skills. The more you negotiate, the better you're going to be at it. Just makes sense, right? So just as if you're tasked to work with giving a presentation or drawing up an important business document or proposal, if you're offered the opportunity to negotiate, even at this young stage in your career, we urge you to take it. So at this point in the Zoom webinars, we would usually take a few questions. We're running a little bit long, so we're just going to take one, I think. Let's pick one, and then next time we'll get some more of them. So this is coming from Saul in Deadwood, South Dakota, Black Hills territory. So Saul writes, I prefer a cooperative style. Am I destined to a life of failure at the negotiating table? So Dad, I'm going to direct this one to you, if that's okay, for Saul.
Sure, Nick. Saul, I'll be brief since we're at the end here, but hardly. You can be a cooperative negotiator, cooperative style, and be incredibly effective. In fact, Cohen, the gentleman that Nick referred to earlier, the master negotiator, says cooperative style negotiating and tactics work about 85% of the time in our culture. Most of us have ingrained in us, thanks mom and dad, but notions of fairness, of reciprocating. When people seem to be being reasonable, we try to be reasonable and kind, but not always. You'll find people who are not. But we all have to develop the stomach to be competitive and to use competitive tactics when the type of negotiation demands it, or when that's what we get from the other side. So it's easier to start cooperative and turn competitive than it is to start competitive and then you kind of lose face if all of a sudden you become a paper tiger and you're much more cooperative. But the short answer to your question, Saul, is that cooperative style negotiators fare very well as long as they know what they're doing and when they need to push themselves a bit. So Nick, that's my answer to Saul.
Yeah, thanks. I think that's great. And Saul, I would say that, if you negotiate long enough, and if you're around long enough, you're likely going to run into a competitive negotiator who tries to run you over, and that's okay. So hopefully with our help, you can recognize that. It's just a strategy. It's not an indictment of you, that's for sure. But you recognize you're in a negotiation with a competitive negotiator, maybe even a true a-hole who just wants to steamroll you. And that's okay. Just know how to play defense on it. Know what he wants, and then know how to kind of counteract that. It's very doable. It certainly doesn't mean that you need to be or to adopt that same style, especially if it's not really your personality, which good for you if it's not. It's not mine either. So excellent question, Saul. You're not doomed to a lifestyle of poor deals. You're going to be just fine, I think. So that's our one question for this week that we're going to answer. But as always, if you do have any questions for us, or if you have any topics for future Zoominars, or just any other comments, words of encouragement, whatever, please leave us a message on our website. Again, that's bobandnickslater.com. Make sure to follow us on social media. Check out our YouTube. We're going to have lots of contents and updates in the coming weeks and this fall. And of course, as we always do, we'd like to remind you that our book is available via Amazon for the preposterously low price of $21.99. If you haven't checked it out yet, please do so. If you think you know someone who would benefit from it, please get it for them, or direct them to our website or to Amazon. So we will be back 2 weeks from today. That's Wednesday, November 18th at 12:15 p.m. Like we said, we'll be discussing negotiation again for the second of our 3-part series, and we'll be getting to more of your questions this time, not just the one. That's a promise. So on behalf of my dad, the Look Out Above team, thanks for being with us today. Hope you enjoyed it, and have a great week.